Hi, this is Jeff Elton, CEO of Concerto Health AI. Thank you for the opportunity to present at DIA 2020. Today, I'm going to speak about RWD-enabled digital clinical development. So to consider actual new approaches or any approach to clinical development today, it is very difficult to ignore the impact of COVID-19. COVID-19 is leading to changes in standard of care, greater use of teleconsult tools, changes in who's selected to treat, changes in the amount of testing performed during that particular process, and actually modifications to what may be with us for quite some time to what standard of care itself looks like. Obviously, all of those changes, as well as actually the possible outcomes of the patients undergoing treatment, has enormous impact on clinical development, clinical trials, clinical trial design, and selections of patients for study eligibility. Second, RWD today can actually be a guide to clinical study design. It can start informing designs that are closer to standard of care and therefore reduce burden. It can actually inform designs that are more executable across an array of settings. It can inform designs that use greater reliance on real-world evidence-based approach or data that comes out of clinical source systems, and a range of things that in fact offer more option, more utility in faster, more productive execution times of clinical studies. When we add the power of RWD to the power of AI, we're actually going to see new levels of precision and productivity enabled across the full continuum of clinical development and clinical study types. And then finally, there is the emergence of an entirely new paradigm for RWE digital clinical development that we will talk about, and then finally some concluding statements. So today, COVID-19 has enormous impact across all diseases, but oncology patients seem to be uniquely vulnerable, and that's led to an array of different changes. Some new clinical entities have been delayed in launch. Clinical studies underway have actually been halted, and an array of new studies that have been planned for this period actually did not get initiated. In fact, in the United States overall, across all therapeutic areas, the amount of clinical trial volumes declined about 70% over the course of about the last 90 to 120 days plus. And oncology trials in particular, which is disproportionately the largest share of the clinical development pipeline, were reduced by about 50%. FDA has recognized this completely unprecedented time and is actually allowing for a range of protocol modifications to currently in-flight studies and actually reconsideration of study designs going forward. Some of these study designs can use EMR-sourced components, whether as external control arms or actually direct clinical extraction. They're actually supporting and actually even encouraging use of electronic patient-reported outcomes or data captured through a teleconsult or other remote electronic means, and actually even stating that the context and the setting where trials can be conducted can actually be expanded because of the need to get these studies underway and the need to advance these therapeutics to patients. That actually puts even more onus and more kind of need to actually use different tools, different approaches for considering these clinical study redesigns or for study designs for studies to be initiated. And one of the things we'd like to point out is that real-world data has now achieved a level of confidence, precision, veracity, and reliability over the course of the last 24 to 36 months that it never actually had before, particularly in high precision medical fields like oncology. In one example from some of the work that we're now conducting, a subscription product that actually is renewed every single month contains between 80 and 120 fields that are abstracted out of unstructured data elements with the same sophistication of a clinical trial. In fact, following protocols akin and sets of rules for those abstractions akin to what would be done in a clinical setting or in an RCT format of study. As an example of some of this, we can actually compare these three different alternative designs, one of which actually is progression-free survival, which is the red curve at the top. This is actually direct clinical measurement of features that are actually found in an array of different clinical notes, appended PDF documents, and comparing that to surrogate measures, which are represented by the blue and the green line, one being time to treatment discontinuation and time to next therapy. And what you'll notice if you look into the values on the right-hand side, a substantial difference in progression-free survival numbers, and actually a substantial difference in the confidence intervals, such that actually it would make a difference between whether a therapeutic entity would be approvable or whether a physician would choose to treat or not treat according to a particular approach. This is enormously important as one thinks about data sources, but it also can be enormously confidence enhancing if these data are now used as the basis for clinical study planning and actually for comparator analysis and for understanding the paradigm with confidence of what current standard of care actually looks like. Similarly, we can look at very complicated concepts like line of therapy. In this particular case, again, using breast cancer as the example, we can see transitions from first line initiation to second, third, and so forth. And actually each one of these distributions and each one of these particular pathways and interconnections across the lines can actually be evaluated and analyzed for different assessments and different protocols of interest. Similarly, we can take different data sets and either the same or different comparator protocols and optimize them. In this case, we're looking at the traditional nature of a set of inclusion-exclusion criteria coming down through a funnel and actually looking at the consequent of the resulting number of patients at the bottom for each one of these individual study designs. This would obviously be related then to the rate and the range of different clinical sites and patient accessible populations that would need to be accessed by these studies, and would also give you a lot of sense of the cost and duration of these particular studies. In many of these cases, we're actually using some AI-based values that are actually allowing us to streamline some of these concepts. In this particular case, the HER2 values are an AI-derived value, which streamline analysis. We, in fact, certain biopharmaceutical companies that are now using these types of data sets and these types of analytic approaches are actually noting that clinical studies can actually be designed in less than half the time of traditional approaches. In addition to that, they actually hold the promise of lowering the overall execution time of a study. Let me talk a little bit more about the impact of AI and deep learning models about how we think about clinical studies and clinical study design. First, let's take a look at how for non-small cell lung cancer, how can we evaluate who meets the criteria for study eligibility? So in this particular case, we're actually looking at potentially still meeting the study endpoint objectives, but actually modification of the criteria that still would enable that, with the idea that these subtle modifications may even reflect and allow twice as many patients to potentially participate in that clinical study design. So in fact, one of the conclusions out of this analysis that was actually conducted in collaboration with ASCO and Forensic Cancer Research is that use of narrow criteria should only be done when, in fact, there's a compelling scientific reason and it's actually part of the study design itself. Whereas a broadening of the criteria to be slightly more reflective of the ultimate receiving population for that therapeutic entity would also benefit the ability to accrue patients to that particular clinical study design. Next, we can actually look at the imputation of ECOG status. ECOG status actually describes a patient's performance status. This would actually be their level of functioning for daily activity, physical ability. It would also indicate their ability to participate in the study, conduct all the activities in the study, and likely be capable of completing the study. Again, this can actually be enormously important for influencing key characteristics of who's actually included in the study design and actually whether the study is going to be executable or can be completed in a reasonable period of time. Next, we can actually look at the impact of natural language processing and deep learning to identify metastatic cancer patients for potential actually eligibility and then later inclusion in the study itself. This can actually be seen where we can both actually use NLP, natural language processing, and deep learning to get metastatic status and actually metastatic site. So between these two, with very high precision and recall, we can identify patients of interest out of a combination of structured and unstructured data processed in near real time with natural language processing. Next, we can actually identify patients of very specific characteristics. In this case, we're actually using AI model, XGBoost deep learning models to predict patients with slow progression for potential study eligibility. Again, with very high precision and recall that can start informing key clinical parameters, in this case, laboratory values and prior history of therapy. Now let's integrate some of these together and actually identify how they might lead to differences in how clinical studies are both constructed and ultimately executed. Stepping back for a moment, we have a point of view that actually precision treatment in clinical research will move from being considered distinct and separate with separate personnel and separate technical infrastructure to actually being more integral to each other. In areas like oncology and cancer care, where we're actually increasingly getting narrower specifications of who's going to be treated with what particular therapeutic entities under what particular set of clinical pathways, and even getting into more precise, narrow treatment for very rare cancers, this becomes even more important. Here's an example of where we can actually take some of the data sets that we saw, plus some of the models that we've been reviewing, and actually take two parallel but complementary views. On the left-hand side, we see the view of a life sciences company of comparing their alternative study designs to standard of care and actually past studies. So in this particular case, the green RWE line represents the real-world evidence-based current standard of care, and the red line actually presents an alternative study design relative to that standard of care. On the right-hand side, we can see the clinical practitioner view. This would actually show them either within their own practice or within a practice network or within a health system or against a large reference database, some of those same particular characteristics, which would enable them to both understand the workload as well as the relative kind of burden that this may place on their own patients should they actually choose to become part of this particular study. At the same time, we can also take a look and model out a range of simultaneous factors to optimize a total study design. In this case, we're looking at a range of inclusion-exclusion criteria, a targeted patient population, a targeted survival curve and time for study completion, a targeted set of other characteristics that actually would lead to the fulfillment of the overarching study. So if on the left-hand side, I have a set of tools that actually allow me to do optimization of the study and the study design, and actually where and how I may want to deploy that. On the right-hand side, as a healthcare provider, I have a range of tools that can actually show me study benefit to the targeted patient population, the burden that it will place on the practice, the burden this will place on the patient, and characteristics and the ability to identify these particular patients in real time, in line with their clinical workflows. The importance of these characteristics, particularly to the provider side, is a lower burden to the practice study that also represents a burden comparable to standard of care, both raises the likelihood of a practice participating, it also raises the likelihood of a patient participating, and it increases the likelihood of patient completion. If I integrate all of these considerations together, I actually can begin to see what a future model of an RWE and AI-driven precision clinical development digital model may look like. One is precision, multiple parameters, multiple optimizations that actually make a study more comparable to standard of care, leverages insights into current outcomes and benefits of standard of care, and all other characteristics allow this to have higher utility and greater precision. Second, the design optimized for executability, optimized for practice burden, optimized for patient burden, ability to identify patient for study eligibility within clinical workflows, all lead to better, faster, and more productive execution time across all this. When you integrate these components together, we see that this drives to an entirely new level of productivity for clinical development and even for post-approval study designs. Study capacity can be increased. The ability to take study and novel execution approaches to those studies can actually be enhanced. And in fact, we're predicting a bit of a blurring between what had been purely retrospective approaches to now actually having the ability to do prospective RWE studies and actually integrate retrospective data with some novel prospective approaches. Together, these actually offer the promise of much greater patient benefit as we're able to advance much more selective and effective new therapies more rapidly through clinical and actually make them available. Thank you very much.